Miranda Massie, vous êtes avocate de formation, spécialiste dans les questions donc de justice environnementale, activiste dans plusieurs coalitions sur le climat et la culture. En 2014, vous avez créé ce musée qui s'appelle Climate Museum à New York, que vous dirigez aujourd'hui, premier musée consacré à la question du climat aux États-Unis, un sujet qui évidemment n'est pas facile à transcrire dans un vocabulaire muséal. Évidemment, vous êtes à mi-chemin entre les enjeux scientifiques et les enjeux artistiques. Formidable champ de réflexion sur la place de l'art, sur la place des objets pour générer de la réflexion intellectuelle. L'art, l'apprentissage et l'autonomisation au service de la justice climatique, c'est le titre de cette conférence. Nous avons traduit dans le programme ce titre de cette manière-là, l'art, l'apprentissage et l'autonomisation. Autonomisation a été la traduction du mot empowerment. Et puis nous nous sommes dit qu'il valait peut-être mieux utiliser un néologisme pour comprendre la force de ce terme empowerment qui est dans le titre, dans la langue originale, puisque la conférence va être donnée en anglais. Donc les traductrices vont plutôt traduire ce terme d'empowerment par empouvoirment. C'est une traduction qui est souvent utilisée par les militantes féministes, mais vraisemblablement que c'est la traduction qui est la meilleure dans le cadre de cette présentation. On vous écoute.
Merci beaucoup pour l'accueil généreux. Je voudrais tellement parler avec vous en français, mais je vous jure que ça ira beaucoup mieux si je change à l'anglais. Alors, let me start by thanking and congratulating the city of Geneva for its really extraordinary recognition of the social power of the cultural sector. I think that's, if not unique, certainly exceptional in the world today, and represented beautifully in this conference where it's an honor to follow such a suite of brilliant and also varied presentations. Somewhat like Emma, I'll be using the Climate Museum a bit as an example. I'll focus mostly on the most recent exhibition that we've presented. But I'll also delve a little bit into works earlier presented later on in the slide deck that we've prepared. I have three overarching themes to discuss with you today. The first is the polycrisis that we inhabit. We inhabit a conglomeration of crises, and the hypothesis that I present to you is that at the center of this polycrisis is the interpenetrating climate crisis and crisis of inequality. And I'll speak more about why those things are so tightly bound together at some length in what follows. My second theme is quite logical in relation to the first. The urgent and absolute need for a transformation toward public and community power. And then the third theme barely needs elaboration after the extraordinary words we've already heard today, but it is the critical role for the cultural sector, and in particular for museums, and in particular for museums that mobilize aesthetics and the arts in elevating and mobilizing this necessary transfer of power that we need to see in order to inhabit a climate-stabilized and just future. So on the first theme, the climate crisis and its interpenetration with the crisis of inequality, as the central motor of the overall crisis that we inhabit, which includes, for example, disinformation, intensifying levels of racism, and its frank expression in the wealthy world. Here I can gesture toward the recent elections in the EC and toward the shameful shameful phenomenon that is Donald Trump in the United States. We're seeing a return to fascist forms from a century ago, a threat of a return to fascism. There's a growing polarization in our societies, in particular, again, in the wealthy world. And at the center of all this, it's my hypothesis that I present to you, is the climate and inequality crises and how they are bound together because together they created the world economy that we inhabit. This is a scene from the very first day of our most recent exhibition, and I like to think of this young character as the future. She's walking toward an image of the past connected to the present, a past of violent domination and exploitation, and she might be deterred or afraid by this image, which is much bigger than she is, but she's not. And we shouldn't be afraid either. We can make the future we want. This was the first panel in this show, which is called, as you can see, The End of Fossil Fuel. The fossil fuel industry is currently one of the major centers of power in the world. The fossil fuel industry and, as a corollary, the use of government power in the wealthy world and also the developing world, the rank obedience of state power to the fossil fuel industry, which has to be interrupted. For example, most recent figures. I'd like to accept a guess from the audience here. I apologize for the use of US currency. How many dollars a minute did the fossil fuel industry receive in public subsidies, most recent figure, for the last year? Just guess. $13 million a minute. Every minute of the year. Imagine if we subsidized public education or cultural institutions at a rate of $13 million a minute worldwide. Or peace efforts. Take your pick. The fossil fuel industry has caused a level of suffering that's almost incomprehensible. The destruction, the dispossession, and without defeating the fossil fuel industry and its grip on public power, without the transfer of power to communities and to a democratic process, humanity will not survive in a form that we recognize. And it's critical to explain this interpenetration of the climate crisis and the crisis of inequality to the public at large in a way that's tangible and emotional, because we are physical beings and emotional beings long before, even on our best day, we are rational beings. This lenticular map showed from one angle, by nation, contributions to the climate crisis in the form of emissions since the Industrial Revolution. And then seen from the other angle, it showed vulnerability by nations currently, suffering currently, to those emissions. As probably most of the people in this room are aware, these two maps are virtual mathematical inverses of each other. There are some exceptions, but essentially, it's a mathematical inverse. And Sarah, as you were just saying, you need to use your body to understand the map. You have to go back and forth a couple of times. And if you want to see whether you're safer living in the US, which has contributed almost a quarter of the emissions that are causing the climate crisis, 25%. With what percent most recently of the world's population? 4, 5? I don't know. Very low. Whether it's safer to live in the US or a social democracy, we could probably all answer that question off the top of our heads. It's better to be in Scandinavia, but you have to go back and forth several times to assess and compare. This map is essentially a map of colonialism. It's a map of what the wealthy world stole from the rest of the world. And more on that later. I'll note in passing, the exhibition moved from black and white, from grayscale, to color around its periphery, as we move from an examination of the history of inequality and extraction that brought us to this dangerous place toward capacity to imagine brighter futures. So you'll see black and white images at first and then some images in color. We always seek at the Climate Museum to represent our subject for a given exhibition on the local level, on the national level, and on the global level, because in New York City we have all three audiences, thanks to the role of New York City in domestic tourism in the US and international tourism. So most American tourists, unless they are going to Las Vegas to gamble, come to New York City. And so we get a lot of visitors who are not from New York, but also a lot of local visitors and a large number of international visitors as well. Here, we have a map where we show that even in the United States, which, because of its extraction, it's imperialist, not colonialist so much, but imperialist extraction of resources from other countries, and despite its massive, excessive contribution to the climate crisis, it is a relatively safe place on the whole to live, as you all have seen in headlines, is nevertheless fraught with peril. And those perils are, of course, unequally distributed in much the same way as the lenticular map shows that the nations that caused the climate crisis are suffering least, and the nations and peoples who have contributed least to the climate crisis are suffering most. In the United States, the perils of the climate crisis and its harms are distributed exceptionally unequally by class and in particular by race. And this map pulled out a few stories to show different ways in which impacts of the climate crisis affect different populations in the US. And here in New York City, I'll pass quickly over this. I think it was one of the stickier and more effective displays that we had, and I think it's very important. But the summary is that almost 100 years ago, in the Great Depression, the federal government of the US decided to offer relief, financial relief, to homeowners who are having difficulty paying their mortgages. They sent out a bunch of analysts to draw lines around neighborhoods that were meant to capture the financial risk of offering mortgage relief in the form of loans to people living in those neighborhoods. These lines, have people heard the expression redlining here in Europe? Perhaps not. There's a term redlining that captures this. The analysts used red pens around neighborhoods that were deemed unsafe or risky for financial investment, for relief from the difficulties of the Great Depression. Those neighborhoods were explicitly and without any stigma or embarrassment at all defined exclusively in relation to race and closeness to the immigrant experience. So for example, neighborhoods that were redlined were Black, they were Mexican. I'm using the terms used by the analysts at that time. They were infiltrated by Jews or Italians, infiltrated. And so we see that the crisis of racism and of the migrant experience that's received attention today is reflected in this exhibit when you move the plexiglass door back over the map that captures places that were redlined and compares them with places that were green-lined, which were inhabited by business executives, all of whom were white in 1930, politicians. Currently today, those neighborhoods are 15 degrees hotter on a hot summer day than neighborhoods that were green-lined, mostly through the mechanism of trees. So there's been a system of disinvestment financially in those neighborhoods. And as we all know, extreme heat is becoming a massive public health danger in the climate crisis. And if you live in a neighborhood that a federal analyst 100 years ago drew a red line around because of the race or immigration status of its inhabitants, you are more likely to suffer heat stroke, and you are more likely to die of heat stroke than a person who lives in a neighborhood that was, again, 100 years ago, green-lined because it was inhabited by wealthy and white people. An extraordinary example, an extraordinarily literal example, more literal than most examples of the weight of history that we have to cast off to move forward toward a just society. Sacrifice zones is a term that Karine Durand and I talked about how to translate. Essentially, the notion is that in order to function, the fossil fuel industry requires zones that are inhabited by people whose lives and health and well-being are deemed by the authorities to have less meaning and value, and so they can be sacrificed in order for the fossil fuel industry to function. And this system is built into the history of the fossil fuel industry. There we go. When would you define the climate crisis as beginning? What would you point out as the beginning point? Anyone? The Industrial Revolution. It completely makes sense. 100% agreed, because that's when the mass burning of fossil fuels started. But the Industrial Revolution never would have happened without colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade. So from the very beginning, our current world economy comes out of systematized racism and exploitation. As just one tiny example of this, the very first steam engine in Great Britain, which in the United States, to step back for a moment, in the United States at least, we are taught to think of the Industrial Revolution as a phenomenon that happened in Britain as if it were not just an island physically, but an island conceptually, that engendered the development of an abused, urbanized, white working class in Britain, and that also promoted enormous development in multiple fields. It's not seen as part of a world system. But the very first steam engine in what became the United Kingdom was financed by plantation owners in the Caribbean. So it was financed by colonialism and transatlantic slavery. So it's critically important to understand that these systems can't be separated from each other in today's world, because the historical process that delivered them to us, or us to them, has them interpenetrating at a molecular level. So racism is built into the fossil fuel industry. Violence and exploitation are built into its operations. It's not just a moral question to combine a commitment to inclusion and egalitarianism with climate activism, which is sometimes how it presents, at least on the American climate movement. It's operationally necessary in order for us to succeed, to have this recognition that these are systems that are woven together in the cloth of history in a thorough way. As is now increasingly well known, the fossil fuel industry also requires an immense amount of very expensive lying and disinformation to continue, to maintain its social license to operate, which is a phrase that the fossil fuel industry itself uses in calls with shareholders, because it recognizes how terribly flimsy its hold on power is. It is at once a dominant force in world affairs and an industry that spends many hundreds of millions of dollars deceiving us in order to be able to continue its exploitation. Are people familiar with the story of Exxon New? Many decades ago, 4 decades ago, Exxon and then other fossil fuel companies, they had scientists who were among the most forward-thinking climate scientists of their time, and they understood. In fact, they made predictions about what today's climate would look like absent aggressive, ambitious, compassionate action by the world's governments. Their calculations were astoundingly, impressively, in a certain way, precise. And what did they do at that time? Did they stop and warn us? No. Did they change their behavior in any way? Yes, they did. They started thinking about how they were going to be able to continue to drill in the Arctic with rising oceans, for example. They started thinking about how they would adapt to the climate disaster they would creating. And I'll leave you with this fact that's almost too painful to think about. Fully 2/3 of the emissions, 66% of the emissions that have caused the climate crisis that we inhabit today have been released, after Exxon scientists knew and told their superiors what would happen. Confirmed by internal memos, 2/3. So this is a set of entities that deserves, at the very least, to lose its social license to operate. More likely, and there's now a theory that's being discussed in the legal academy in the United States, more likely there are a number of people who should face prison time because they have knowingly caused death and destruction around the world, and they continue to do that. Now I'm pivoting to my second theme, which consists, in the end, of very good news. But first, it's clear, and you can see here on the left of your screen, even in the United States, which has been quite backward on these matters, we've achieved tremendous victories toward climate justice. The distance we have left to travel is longer than the distance we have come, but we have achieved victories that would have seemed outlandish. The Green New Deal in the United States, which I hope people are at least a little bit familiar with, a sweeping program of social and ecological interventions, seemed completely insane when it was first floated by a bunch of young people. It seemed very rational, but it seemed politically impossible, politically insane, until it wasn't, and until a number of its provisions were enacted into national policy. We've also seen some success stories. Here I'll focus on the international level with Land Back. I'm not sure how to help with the translation there, but it's the giving back of ancestral lands to indigenous peoples around the world. There are now many, many hundreds of millions of acres under indigenous stewardship, which conjoins justice and ecological thriving, since traditional ecological knowledge has done much better with respect to the climate and ecological remediation that we need than modern practices have. And the very, very critical point is that This isn't a dream. It's not a progressive fantasy. We can achieve this. And I'm going to speak of the US, which has been more backward than most other nations on this subject, in part because that's where we have the most data. There's a huge, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time with this slide. You'll recognize our charismatic visitor from the first slide. Our photographer probably took 100 pictures of her. I had to drag her away from this child because the child was so exceptionally energetic and lovely. In the United States, there is an enormous supermajority of the population that favors climate justice. This is true in every state. So, for example, abortion rights are currently thought to be set up to play a major role in the upcoming presidential election. 61% of the US supports abortion rights, and that, in American terms, is a massive electoral majority that can swing elections, and that has swung a series of elections in the last couple of years. The supermajority for renewable energy and climate justice is 70%, depending on the exact question you're asking. Sometimes it's 69, sometimes it's 71, but it's 70%. That in the US, with its political polarization, is a profound tool at our disposal. So why aren't we seeing better outcomes? Because that supermajority consistently believes itself to be in a small minority. This is true in every state. For example, in Mississippi, recall the 61% of Americans for abortion rights and the Supreme Court case Roe versus Wade, which some people are probably familiar with. 61% of people in Mississippi want to see climate justice policies enacted. 61%. Mississippians will tell you it's in the low 30s. Researchers, this was a year and a half ago that this study came out. The information is quite new. Researchers found this phenomenon of underestimation and belief in being an outnumbered, powerless minority in opinion terms to be so strong and so pervasive that they told the editors of the peer-reviewed journal where they published the paper that they could not use the term, the more general term, pluralistic ignorance, which has a general application to many different phenomena. For example, college students believe that binge drinking is much more popular than it actually is. And so you can see there are forms of pluralistic ignorance that have a negative impact on people's behavior because we're very normative creatures in the end, no matter how independent and idiosyncratic we sometimes are and would like to believe we are. In the end, we're exceptionally normative as mammals. So pluralistic ignorance is the general term, and these three social scientists went to their editors and said, it's just not strong enough. It's too general, it's too weak. We need to call this a false social reality. So in the United States, there's a false social reality, and I would imagine this is true in Switzerland and across many other countries as well. There's a false social reality pursuant to which people think that they're in a small minority in wanting to see a regenerative economy, in wanting to see clean energy, in wanting to see climate justice, when in fact we are in a supermajority. That misunderstanding causes us to remain silent when what we need is a vibrant, robust culture of discourse around climate and climate justice. So the good news is we don't have to change people's minds. We just have to inform people that they are part of a supermajority, and we have seen the impact of this in our own work. I'm now going to turn to my third theme, which again has been amply covered throughout the day, and I'll be moving more quickly through the slides now. Museums and the cultural sector are critical to the social transformation we need to see. Studies show that museums are deeply trusted and extremely popular. When you algebraically combine trust and popularity, you have transformational capacity. We cannot afford to leave that on the ground. It must be mobilized so that we can confront humanity's crisis and move forward together. Remember, recall, this transition, this transformation is within our reach if we choose it. We've also found museums build community. We've seen this throughout the day. Again, I won't belabor the point. Some earlier projects that we've done have drawn attention to the public sphere, to the public good of, in this case, parks, fossil fueling inequality. I'm glad I don't have to translate that, but it was my favorite of these signs. A project about what home means, what the idea of home means in a time of climate crisis by the brilliant artist Gabriela Salazar. Here she is again dismantling her sculpture and giving it out to members of the public. The power of aesthetics is another part of why museums and the cultural sector have so much ability and such a critically necessary ability to contribute to the change we need to make. This was a show about deep time and ice cores, and this gallery was turned into essentially a secular chapel, a chapel to science. It was spectacular. The arts can also allow us to envision a brighter future. This is from the show we did most recently that you saw at the top. But art doesn't have to be cheerful. It doesn't need to present a brighter future in order to make people understand their own agency, their own ability to take meaningful action on these crises. This was a previous show where another very brilliant artist, David Opdyke, constructed, it doesn't present that well in photographs because you miss the scale jump, but he took antique postcards, made painterly interventions in them, and assembled them so that each postcard became a pixel in a larger image of catastrophe. But because here you see a little bit the landscape he's creating, because of the intelligence and the humor and, I emphasize, the aesthetic strength of his work, people came away from this work of art ready to learn about their own power and ready to take action, not shut down, even though it was deeply dystopian. Gallows humor sometimes goes a long way in our work. Finally, we discovered early on through a couple of mistakes, we started presenting public programming in 2018, that creating a sense of community and creating a sense of empowerment, again that word that doesn't translate easily, isn't enough. Because people are so unfamiliar with our own capacity to make a difference on these critical matters, it's important to scaffold action possibilities. And so we have landed on the mechanism of a blank wall. This was the first day of our most recent exhibition. And giving people specific action choices and also a sticker that's open and that allows you to write your own action. Because in giving people options, they may not call their representative or tell their bank to stop investing in fossil fuels or any of the other things that we specifically suggest, but making the suggestions specific and actionable and concrete gives people ideas about their own spheres of capacity so that they can personalize it. And over the course of the exhibition, tens of thousands of people, as you can see, added their own voices, allowing people to visualize themselves as part of a creative community of climate actors, of climate protagonists, if you will. This was on Earth Day, which, as people probably know, is April 22nd, pretty close to the end of the show. In closing, my call to action to everyone here. We cannot afford the luxury of either hope or despair. So with respect, we cannot afford the pessimism of we're probably not going to save the world. And much less can we afford a shallow optimism that cheerfully recounts victories that don't go far enough. Instead, we have to commit ourselves to action, to our own agency, to our own need and right to be part of moving things forward for the whole community at different scales, at the scale of the neighborhood, the city, the nation, the world. This reminds me of, I think it was one of the final moments in the film about care that was so lovely. Care is an action. We can't afford passive postures, whether they're positive or negative. Sometimes people talk about hope or fear in the climate crisis. Both are reasonable to house, to hold in your heart. But that's not the point. The point is what you do. And I would encourage everyone here who has a role with capacity in a cultural institution to encourage action, to have a call to action for your visitors. In an old-fashioned way, museums have often felt that it reduces public trust, or it reduces, in an even more old-fashioned way, their authority to call for action. But studies show quite the contrary, that calling for action that's consistent with your mission as an institution enhances public trust very strongly. You will be emotionally rewarded to an extraordinary degree by the response of your visitors. I can promise you that. And I would say to the people here who do not hold positions of authority in cultural sector institutions, think about what your own sphere of trust and authority is and mobilize it for social justice and for climate progress. We all have much more capacity than we recognize. We are taught to think of ourselves as small and weak. That's always available in our societies. And in fact, we have tremendous capacity to influence the people around us and to create a ripple effect of change that can transform the world. In closing, I want to ask if you will please indulge me in an emotional exercise of imagination. So if we can close our eyes just for a moment and take a breath. Please picture, please visualize a climate stable and just world. And now ask yourself, what does that world look like? Who are you in it? What are you doing in it? Bringing you back to the room, that's the world we can make together. Thank you all.
Merci beaucoup, Miranda Massie. Cette journée est placée sous le titre Pouvoir et musée, musée et pouvoir. On voit bien que votre musée à vous s'insère dans un monde où le pouvoir économique est évidemment hyper dur, hyper présent. je voulais, avant de passer la parole aux questions du public, j'avais envie de savoir qui paye votre musée. On voit bien qu'en face de vous, il y a des gens qui ont beaucoup, beaucoup d'argent. Votre pouvoir économique, vous le tenez d'où?
We have a terrible trouble being funded. First, I'll say admission is free. All of our programs are free, in part because in the United States, that's not normal. Most museums are very expensive in New York, not in Washington, D.C., but throughout the United States and other cities, most museums are ridiculously expensive, actually. And it's understandable. It's very expensive to create beautiful things in physical space, right? Or beautiful things in virtual space. It all costs a lot. We don't fit, I think this is starting to soften, but there has been a blind spot in philanthropy. So climate funders don't understand us because we're not about policy or technology. Arts funders think that we're somehow dirtying art, sullying art. Sorry if I'm going too fast, I'll slow down. Because we're using art, we're mobilizing art for a purpose of social engagement, which is very absurd because in the United States, at least, and I think everywhere, arts have always been part of social movements and are often used for social purposes. It's just normal. But climate is not sufficiently seen by philanthropy. It is by many others. But philanthropy is a very elite world, very detached from the rest of society in the United States, mostly energized by billionaires, bluntly. So they're cut off from the reality that the climate struggle is a social struggle. They see it as a technocratic struggle for policy and technology. We won't get the right policy or the right technology if we don't have the right society and the right culture. So it's been very difficult for us to be, and then finally, funders of justice and climate justice do see our work and understand it, but they also have the pressing concern of, with less funds than climate or arts funders, supporting the work of climate justice communities in sacrifice zones. So it's been very, very difficult, and in fact, we've had to pause our exhibition planning for now to engage in a round of strategic fundraising.
Donc ce sont des fonds privés?
Yes, private foundations and private individuals with support from New York State and New York City. Non-trivial support, but not nearly enough for what we need. But the funding of most museums, the majority of the funding of most museums in the United States is private, which is broken, clearly, very unhealthy.
Est-ce qu'il y a des questions dans la salle? Si ce n'est pas le cas tout de suite, moi j'aimerais vous en poser une deuxième. Okay. Tout à l'heure, on a entendu Ludovic Maggioni parler de sa manière de faire au musée d'histoire naturelle de Neuchâtel, de toujours mentir. C'est ce qu'il nous a dit. Je mens toujours aux visiteurs, aux visiteuses. Je n'aborde jamais frontalement ces enjeux qui sont en fait très politiques, très idéologiques, fragiles aussi. Et nous, dans ce qu'on a vu des slides que vous nous avez montrés, j'ai l'impression qu'au contraire, vous affichez la couleur, vous affirmez un propos militant premier degré, je pourrais dire. Comment vous réagissez à ce que Ludovic nous disait tout à l'heure, qu'il faut mentir pour attirer les gens au musée?
I think we hide some of the truth too, for sure. We don't start with how advanced the climate crisis is, for example. So that's a choice that some climate activists would regard as equivalent to a lie. We do tell hard truths about racism and the fossil fuel industry. We don't emphasize, we don't underscore how much worse things will necessarily get because of the momentum that's built into the climate system. As painful as the current impacts of the climate crisis are, it will get worse before it gets better. That's something we'll happily tell visitors if they engage us in a conversation, but we haven't yet put it on the wall. So I think this is maybe a reference I'm surprised to find myself making, but President Obama's press secretary once said that his job was to tell the truth slowly. And I think we can all have different definitions of what's slow and what's fast, but if you told only the most salient truths about the climate and social justice crisis, nobody would come in. That's for certain. Si j'ai répondu?
Vous avez
C'est
répondu.
responsive?
C'est responsif. Ah voilà, il y a plein de mains qui se lèvent. Alors.
Yes, hello, Brenda Edgar, I'm from the MEG. Hi. I was wondering, because a lot of Exxon and Mobil, they engage in a lot of philanthropy themselves,
Yeah.
especially in the cultural industry. I don't know if it's still the case, they've financed a great deal of public television and radio. I mean, how do you approach that problem?
We approach it by making the acceptance of their money a fireable offense for me. So it's forbidden. Not only that, but we can't take money from big banks because they finance the expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure. And here's an anecdote about that. 3 or 4 months ago, Bill McKibben, the climate activist and writer in America, has founded a new organization for people age 65 and up. It's called Third Act, about passing on a legacy of activism and a thriving future. And they did a national protest. In fact, I think it had some international elements against Chase Bank, which is the biggest funder of fossil fuel infrastructure, including, guys, new fossil fuel infrastructure. I mean, there's absolutely no conceivable argument in good faith for that funding. The very same day, they didn't even wait 24 hours, another major bank reached out to me by themselves, asking if they could do a sponsorship. So we had to very politely explain, no, they couldn't, and here's why, but we would be delighted to give them a free tour and continue the conversation. And we did not, you won't be surprised to hear, receive a response to our message. But that does further restrict our ability to raise private funds because we inhabit a fossil fuel economy. Now, we're all part of that economy. Obviously, we take some private money, and it is all inherently soaked in oil and blood, frankly. But there are shades of gray, and we draw the line in as light a color gray as we can.
Thank you. I have one more question on
please.
that.
Ah, il y a encore une question.
As an actor in the cultural industry, how do you position yourself in regards to other institutions that do take money from Chase Manhattan, from Mobil, from Exxon?
Here's how I think about that.
How do you talk about them?
Yeah, I think it's a very dynamic situation because the climate activist movement is starting to challenge the receipt of those funds. And it's a situation that's shifting. For us, as a new, small, young institution that wants to seek partnership and collaboration, that wants to help, for such a young institution, we know much more about how to do this well than other institutions do. They do everything else better than we do. But this we know how to do. And we want to spread that word. When I confront this question, I zoom out and I think about the problems that it causes to try to start a museum. It's rolling a huge rock up a hill. I don't need to convince anyone here. And then I pause and think about what problems would I have if I were directing a museum that had been around for 150 years with all those accumulated barnacles of terrible practices, right? And that's its own kind of difficulty, because if you have, up till now, been accepting money from Bank of America or JP Morgan Chase, you're depending on it, right? It's going to take time to make the point sufficiently that the public trust is damaged by your acceptance of that money for you to wean yourself, for you to get yourself off of that. So I think on the one hand, we have to be quite militant about it in setting a model, and we also have to have compassion and patience toward our fellow institutions that are in a different position that is, in some ways, easier, yes, but in many ways more difficult because of established practices.
On a encore une question au deuxième rang.
Yes, maybe I can complement your answer to the first question on truth. You said that the fossil fuel industry gets 13 million subsidies per minute. It amounts to a large chunk of the global GDP. It's probably larger than the size of the whole industry. So are you sure the figures are right?
Yes. And I'm happy to track down the source and send it to you, but yes.
Alors, on aura un échange de chiffres. Est-ce qu'il y a encore une question dans la salle adressée à Miranda Massie? Si ce n'est pas le cas, on va faire un moment de pause pendant lequel vous pouvez rester là si vous voulez. On va diffuser un... Oui, on peut applaudir Miranda, c'est vrai.